The congregation had come for a sermon, but they got a murder instead. One minute, Pastor Malcolm Hayes was preaching the Word of God. The next, his own wife was standing at the altar, gun in hand, pulling the trigger in front of everyone. But this wasn't a crime of passion, it was a mother's breaking point. Just hours earlier, she had discovered that the man she loved, the man she trusted, had done the unthinkable. Her husband had been abusing their 15-year-old daughter's best friend, a girl they had practically raised as their own. And now, she was pregnant with his child. A trusted man of God. A mother's worst nightmare. A crime that played out in the most sacred of places. Pastor Malcolm wasn't just a husband, he was a predator hiding behind a pulpit. And when his darkest secret came to light, his wife decided that Judgment Day wouldn't wait. What happens when the truth is too unbearable to face? When justice feels out of reach, and revenge takes over? This is a case that will leave you questioning morality, faith, and the fine line between justice and murder. Welcome to Real True Crime Stories, where we uncover the most shocking and controversial cases that leave the world speechless. If you love real crime stories that expose the darkest secrets, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because this one will leave you reeling. Pastor Malcolm Hayes had it all. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose sermons could move even the most hardened souls. His church, Greater Truth Baptist, was one of the most well-respected in California, and his followers believed he was a true man of God. At home, he played the role of a devoted husband to his wife, Vanessa Hayes, the church's beloved First Lady. She was the picture of grace, elegant, soft-spoken, and unwaveringly loyal. For 2 decades, she had stood by his side, raising their only daughter, Imani Hayes, now 15. To everyone who knew them, the Hayes family was perfect. A strong marriage, a thriving church, and a well-mannered, intelligent daughter. But what the world didn't see was the monster that lurked beneath the pastor's holy image. Imani Hayes and Trinity Reynolds had been inseparable since childhood. Both 15, they had met in church when they were just little girls, their friendship forming almost instantly. To Imani, Trinity was more than just a best friend. She was a sister, a confidant, the one person she could always count on. Trinity spent almost as much time at the Hayes home as she did her own. She ate at their dinner table, went on vacations with them, and even had a spare toothbrush in their bathroom. She was mature for her age, tall for 15, with a confidence that made her seem older than she really was. Maybe that was why Malcolm noticed her. While Malcolm preached about purity and righteousness every Sunday, he was living in the shadows of his own sin. It started with small things, a lingering glance, an innocent touch that lasted too long. He was careful at first, making sure no one would suspect a thing. But the more Trinity stayed over, the bolder he became. She had trusted him. She saw him as a second father. But trust meant nothing to a man like Malcolm. What happened behind closed doors would remain a secret for months. Until one day, it all came crashing down in the most devastating way possible. Trinity Reynolds had always been a healthy, energetic teenager. But lately, something felt off. At first, it was small things, a sudden wave of nausea in the morning, feeling dizzy when she stood up too fast. Then came the exhaustion. It didn't matter how much sleep she got, she felt drained all the time. Her appetite changed, and she became hypersensitive to certain smells. She chalked it up to stress. School was demanding, and life at home hadn't been the easiest. She had been staying over at the Hayes house more than usual. Maybe she was just tired. But then her period didn't come. The realization hit her like a truck, but she pushed the thought away. It had to be something else. Maybe it was just late. But deep down, she already knew the truth. When Trinity's mother, Angela Reynolds, noticed her daughter's constant fatigue and sudden changes in behavior, a sense of dread crept over her. At first, she thought it might be a virus. Maybe anemia. But something in the back of her mind kept whispering a much darker possibility. One evening, as Trinity sat curled up on the couch, pale and withdrawn, Angela made a decision. "We're going to the hospital," she said. Trinity hesitated, but she didn't argue. She felt too weak to fight. The bright fluorescent lights of the hospital made everything feel surreal. The air smelled of antiseptic, and the sound of distant beeping monitors made Trinity's stomach turn. The nurse asked questions, and Trinity answered them with careful hesitations. She felt her mother's eyes on her, filled with worry, filled with love. Then came the blood test. The waiting. The unbearable silence as they sat together in that small examination room. Finally, the doctor returned with the results. Angela barely breathed as she looked at the doctor's face. And then, the words that shattered her world. "Trinity is pregnant." Angela felt her body go cold. She couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Pregnant? No. That couldn't be. Her little girl. Her baby. The air in the room became suffocating, the walls closing in. Angela turned to her daughter, desperate for an answer, praying for an explanation that would make sense. "Trinity," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Who did this to you?" Trinity stared at the floor, her body trembling. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her cheeks. Angela grabbed her hands. "Baby, tell me. Please." And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Trinity said the name that made Angela's blood run cold. "Pastor Malcolm." The words ripped through Angela's soul like a blade. She yanked her hands away, standing up so fast her chair toppled over. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "No," she shook her head violently. "No, Trinity, that's not possible." But Trinity just sobbed harder. Angela felt her stomach turn. This wasn't just a nightmare, it was real. She had trusted Malcolm. She had seen him as a man of faith, a leader, someone who had guided them for years. And now, he had taken everything from her daughter. Angela's immediate reaction. Angela's entire body shook with rage. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. She grabbed Trinity's hand and yanked her up from the chair. "Let's go," she said, her voice ice cold. "Mom," Trinity's voice cracked with fear. "Where are we going?" Angela's eyes burned with fury. "To get justice." She stormed out of the hospital, her heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. She didn't care what time it was. She didn't care who saw her. There was only one thought in her mind: Malcolm Hayes was going to answer for what he did. And he was going to answer for it tonight. Angela didn't think twice as she sped toward the Hayes residence. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced, her heart pounded, and the anger in her chest burned like fire. Trinity sat beside her, curled up in the passenger seat, silent. She wiped her tears with shaking hands, staring out the window like she wanted to disappear. Angela glanced at her daughter. She looked so small, so fragile. And Malcolm Hayes had done this to her. A man they trusted. A man who had stood in front of a congregation every Sunday and preached about righteousness. Angela clenched her jaw. Tonight, his lies would end. The moment she pulled up to the driveway, she didn't even bother knocking. She pounded on the door, her fists landing with such force that the windows rattled. After a few moments, the door swung open. Vanessa Hayes stood there, wearing a satin robe, her hair pulled into a loose bun, confusion in her eyes. "Angela?" Vanessa's brows furrowed, her lips parting in surprise. "What's going on?" Angela felt something snap inside her. She shoved past Vanessa, storming into the house with Trinity trailing behind. "Where is he?" Angela's voice was ice cold. Vanessa blinked, still trying to process what was happening. "Who?" Angela turned, her chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. Her rage was volcanic. "Your husband," she spat. Where is Malcolm? Vanessa folded her arms, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. He's at the church for midweek service. Why? What's this about? Angela's hands trembled as she turned to Trinity. Her daughter hesitated, swallowing hard. Then, finally, Trinity found her voice. Mom, she whispered. Tell her. Angela felt something inside her shatter, but she steeled herself. She turned back to Vanessa, staring her straight in the eye. Your husband got my daughter pregnant. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Vanessa's face went blank. For a second, she didn't even blink. It was as if her brain refused to process what she just heard. Then, she let out a short, breathless laugh. That's ridiculous, she scoffed. Malcolm would never. He did. Angela screamed, stepping closer. He's a predator. He's been abusing my baby, Vanessa. And now she's pregnant because of him. Angela's hands balled into fists, her whole body shaking with pure, uncontrollable rage. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, her eyes darting to Trinity, who stood there, shaking, tears running down her cheeks. That's when something changed in Vanessa's face. A shadow of doubt. A flicker of fear. But still, she fought it. That's impossible, Vanessa said, her voice quieter this time. Malcolm is a man of God. He wouldn't. Look at her. Angela pointed at Trinity, her voice cracking. Look at her face, Vanessa. She's telling the truth. Vanessa turned to Trinity again. The girl's lower lip trembled. Her shoulders were hunched forward, like she was trying to disappear. Then, she nodded. Silent. Broken. But truthful. And just like that, Vanessa's world shattered. The air felt thick. Suffocating. Angela expected Vanessa to scream. To cry. To deny it again. But Vanessa said nothing. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away. Angela and Trinity exchanged a confused glance. Then, Angela called after her. Vanessa? No response. Angela followed, her heart pounding with confusion. Vanessa, where are you going? Vanessa strode through the house like a woman possessed, her movements eerily calm. Then, she stopped in front of the hallway closet. Angela watched as Vanessa punched in a code on a small keypad next to the door. The lock beeped, and the door clicked open. Vanessa reached inside. Angela's stomach twisted. And then, she pulled out a gun. Angela felt the blood drain from her face. Her breath caught in her throat. What the hell are you doing? She gasped. Vanessa checked the chamber, then clicked the safety off. Her eyes were empty. Angela took a step forward. Vanessa, put that down. You're not thinking straight. Vanessa finally looked up, but her face was unreadable. I need to hear it from his mouth. She grabs her keys and leaves. Angela felt a sickening panic settle in her chest. This was getting out of control. Vanessa, stop. Think about this. We should call the police. We should. Vanessa ignored her. She grabbed her car keys off the counter, her expression locked in stone. Angela rushed in front of her, blocking the door. Vanessa, please, she begged. You don't have to do this. Vanessa tilted her head. Then, in the coldest voice Angela had ever heard, she said. Move. Angela froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Vanessa pushed past her and stepped outside. Angela and Trinity watched in stunned silence as Vanessa got into her car, slammed the door, and peeled out of the driveway. The tires screeched. The car disappeared down the road. Angela swallowed hard. Her entire body was shaking. Trinity gripped her mother's arm, her voice barely above a whisper. Where is she going? Angela didn't answer. She already knew. Vanessa was heading to the church. And Malcolm Hayes was about to face his judgment day. The sanctuary of Greater Truth Baptist Church glowed under the warm, golden light of the chandeliers. The choir swayed in perfect harmony, their voices rising in a heavenly chorus. Hands lifted. Eyes closed. The congregation swayed, lost in worship, believing they were in the presence of righteousness. At the pulpit, Pastor Malcolm Hayes stood tall, Bible in hand, his voice echoing through the church. "God is good," he called out. All the time, the congregation responded. Malcolm smiled, exuding the same charisma that had earned him the love and respect of his flock. But behind that polished image, his hands were filthy with sin. He had destroyed an innocent girl's life. And his wife knew the truth. And tonight, she was coming for him. A loud bang rattled the sanctuary, the double doors flew open so hard they slammed against the walls. The choir's singing abruptly stopped. Heads turned. Murmurs spread through the pews. And then, gasps filled the room. Because standing there, at the entrance of the church, was Vanessa Hayes. Her eyes were wild, burning with fury, her chest heaving with sharp, ragged breaths. In her right hand, she clutched a gun. People in the front pews scrambled back. Mothers grabbed their children. A ripple of terror spread through the congregation. Up at the pulpit, Malcolm froze. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. A deadly silence filled the church. And then, Vanessa started walking. Step by step. Down the aisle. Her heels echoed on the tiled floor. Malcolm's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. Vanessa reached the altar and stopped, staring up at her husband. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. She was boiling over. And then, she raised the gun, pointing it straight at him. "How could you?" she said, her voice sharp and shaking with rage. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Vanessa," Malcolm started, but she cut him off. "You got that girl pregnant." A murmur swept through the congregation. Some people shook their heads in confusion. Others stared at Malcolm, waiting for him to respond. Vanessa's hands clenched tighter around the gun. "A child, Malcolm. A 15-year-old. You ruined her life." A woman in the second pew let out a horrified gasp. Malcolm swallowed hard. His face turned a sickly shade of pale. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape, looking for a way out of this. "Vanessa, please," he said, his voice cracking. But his wife wasn't listening. She was seeing him for what he really was. A monster. And he had fooled everyone. Until now. He shook his head quickly, his preacher's voice slipping back into place. "That's not true," he said, raising his hands like he was still in control. "You're confused, baby. Whatever they told you, it's a lie. You know me." Vanessa let out a bitter laugh. She knew him, all right. She knew the man who stood before his flock every Sunday, dressed in expensive suits, preaching about family and faith. She knew the man who kissed their daughter goodnight with the same lips he used to lie. She knew the man who had violated a child, then walked into this church as if he was still worthy of standing at this pulpit. She stepped closer. And for the first time, she saw it. The guilt in his eyes. The fear. The truth. He had done it. And now, he knew his time was up. Vanessa exhaled sharply, her entire body vibrating with rage. Her finger squeezed the trigger. Bang! The shot rang through the church, shattering the silence. Malcolm jerked backward, his body recoiling. A deep red stain blossomed across his white pastor's robe, right in the center of his chest. A collective scream tore through the congregation. People scrambled out of their seats, pushing and shoving to get away. Some dove under the pews, clutching their children. Others fled for the doors. Malcolm staggered, his legs wobbling beneath him. He looked down at his chest. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Then, he fell to his knees. His hands pressed against his wound, blood seeping through his fingers. His wide, desperate eyes locked onto his wife. But Vanessa wasn't done. Malcolm lifted a shaky hand. Please. His voice was thin, weak. Vanessa's grip on the gun didn't waver. You stole her innocence. Malcolm's eyes bulged. You stole my faith. Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes, but her hands stayed steady. She took a slow breath, then pulled the trigger again. Bang! The bullet slammed into his stomach. Malcolm gasped, his body jerking violently. He collapsed backward, his head hitting the wooden steps behind him. A few seconds of silence. Then, the final shot. Bang! Straight to the head. The last thing Malcolm saw was the stained glass cross above him. Then, nothing. Screams. Wailing. People tripped over pews, stumbling, pushing, fighting to escape. One woman fainted. Another man crawled on his hands and knees, his mouth moving in silent prayer. The choir pressed themselves against the walls, clutching their robes. At the pulpit, Malcolm's body lay motionless, his blood pooling across the altar. A sacred place, defiled. And Vanessa? She just stood there. Breathing heavily. Her eyes locked onto his lifeless body. The gun dangling loosely in her fingers. She had spent 2 decades standing beside Malcolm Hayes. Tonight, she was the one who put him in the ground. It didn't take long for the sirens to pierce the night. By the time the police arrived, the church was in chaos. Hysterical members of the congregation cried and prayed, some still crouched beneath pews, afraid to move. Others had fled entirely, their panicked footsteps echoing in the streets. At the front of the sanctuary, Vanessa Hayes stood motionless. The gun, still warm, still deadly, hung loosely in her fingers. Her eyes remained on Malcolm's lifeless body, the man who had betrayed everything she once believed in. The first officer through the doors raised his weapon. Drop the gun. Hands up. Vanessa didn't flinch. She didn't run. She didn't argue. She simply lifted her hands into the air. The gun clattered to the floor, landing in the pool of blood at her feet. She turned to the officers, her face unreadable, as if she had already accepted her fate. And in a voice as calm as a whisper, she spoke the last words she would say before they took her away. Her chilling last words. I did what needed to be done. The news spread like wildfire. The beloved First Lady of Greater Truth Baptist Church had walked into a Wednesday night service and executed her husband in cold blood. For some, the details didn't matter. They saw a grieving wife, consumed by rage, turning into a murderer before their eyes. But for others, the story was far more complicated. Because when the truth emerged, that Pastor Malcolm had impregnated a 15-year-old girl, a girl Vanessa had once considered family, everything changed. Some called it justice. Some called it revenge. But the state called it murder. Vanessa Hayes was charged with first-degree murder, possession of a firearm in the commission of a felony, and reckless endangerment. Her trial would become one of the most polarizing cases in California's history. Lines were drawn. On one side, supporters flooded social media with messages of solidarity. Vanessa Hayes is a hero. She did what the justice system would have failed to do. What mother wouldn't snap if she found out her husband was a predator? The real crime was what Malcolm did. Vanessa just made sure he paid for it. Church members held candlelight vigils in her honor, praying for leniency. But others were horrified. Murder is murder, no matter what. She should have called TH. Was she a grieving wife who snapped? Or a cold-blooded killer who let anger drive her to murder? While the world debated Vanessa's fate, Angela Reynolds was left to pick up the shattered pieces of her daughter's life. Trinity had once been a bright, carefree teenager. Now, she barely spoke. She refused to go back to school. She refused to see friends. She wouldn't even step inside a church. The betrayal ran too deep. She started intensive therapy, but nothing could erase what had been taken from her. Angela, once full of faith, now found only emptiness. Her daughter had lost her childhood. And in many ways, Angela had lost her faith in humanity. As the trial loomed, one question remained. Was Vanessa right to take justice into her own hands? Or had she, in the heat of rage, become the very thing she despised? Justice, or murder? It was a question the world would never stop asking. Vanessa Hayes thought she had the perfect marriage, the perfect family. But one horrifying revelation changed everything. In an instant, she went from a devoted wife to a murderer, from a first lady to an inmate. Do you think Vanessa's actions were justified, or should she have let the law handle it? And what about Malcolm? Was this the first time, or just the first time he got caught? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love shocking true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe to Real True Crime Stories for more cases that expose the darkest secrets. Until next time, stay safe, and stay aware.